One conditional arrangement, 3 written warnings, 1 clause nobody in her office had ever read, and a set of keys that had to be on a table by a fixed hour on a Thursday morning. Now I'm going to hold the clause itself for a while, because it only lands once you understand what she had spent the previous months doing inside that house. And the honest truth is that most of what she did was not even hidden. It was done in front of staff, in writing, with invoices. Stay with me on this one. It turns on one piece of paper that had been sitting in a file since before any of this started. If you like the ones where somebody finds the document that everybody assumed did not exist, take a second and subscribe, because that is exactly what happened here. Quick word before we go further. I'm Harold. I spend my time going through the occupancy papers, the maintenance codes, the storage lists, and the small print that moves around this family, the documents that nobody reads until the afternoon somebody finally does. And what you're about to hear is me putting the pieces together the way I read them. Stay with me to the end. Because the last box anybody opened in that house is the reason this story exists at all. By the time we finish, you will know what she moved out of those rooms, you will know who wrote the warning she ignored, you will know what was in the sealed box that pulled the Prince of Wales into it, and you will know what happened in an entrance hall at Windsor at about midday on the day the keys were due. Let me start with the months before, because the behavior is the whole story. For a long stretch, Camilla was treating Windsor Lodge as hers, not staying there. Not using it as a grace and favor arrangement the way half that family uses half those buildings. Owning it, in every practical sense, a person can own something without a deed. She approved expensive renovation work. She moved long-serving staff out of posts they had held for years. She restricted which members of the family could walk through the doors, and she described the arrangement to visitors as though the king had handed her the keys permanently and the matter was closed. And nobody pushed back at first. That is the part I keep coming back to. And it is the part that made everything afterwards possible. Silence in that institution is not neutral. Silence is a signal, and the signal it sends is that nobody is watching, and a person who receives that signal for long enough starts making bigger decisions. Then Anne noticed something. This is the bit that changes the shape of the whole story, because it did not come from a lawyer, an auditor, or a journalist. It came from a woman walking through rooms she has walked through her entire life and noticing that things were not where they had always been. Several personal items connected to Queen Elizabeth were gone, and several connected to Diana were gone with them. Not misplaced, not out for cleaning, not being claimed by anybody as personal property. They had been wrapped, labelled, boxed, and moved into storage, under written instructions that traced back to Camilla's private office. William had never approved it. Anne had never been consulted. Nobody in the family had been told any part of it, and none of them would have found out for months if a member of staff had not gone to the Princess Royal and said something. That employee was frightened. Every account of that conversation says so. And I think about that quite a lot, because a person in that job who speaks up is risking a career, a pension, and a reference, and they did it anyway. That one disclosure turned the whole thing over. Up to that point, what had been happening inside Windsor Lodge looked like an energetic woman redecorating a house she had been given. Portraits moved, guest rooms reassigned. Family arrangements cancelled at short notice with no explanation offered to anybody. Read those same events again knowing that objects tied to a dead queen and a dead princess were being crated up and driven out of the building at the same time. And it stops looking like decoration. It looks like a removal. And the staff had been told plainly by people speaking on behalf of that office that the residents now answered to the Queen, not to the King. Not to the household administration that has run those buildings since before any of these people were born. To her. Let me be precise about what that means, because it is the load-bearing point of the entire story. Royal residents are not owned by the people who live in them. Almost none of them are. They are occupied under arrangements, and an arrangement is a set of conditions attached to a set of rooms. Some of them are formal leases with rent and terms. Most of them are family arrangements, held on trust, dependent on continued approval and on the house being used for the purpose it was given for. The consequence is the part that matters, and it is the part her office got wrong. An arrangement can be withdrawn. A deed cannot, and almost nobody inside that family has a deed to anything. Anybody in this country who has watched the news over the past year has already seen this demonstrated. Andrew was in Royal Lodge for 2 decades, with a lease everybody assumed was unbreakable, and in February he was out of it, with removal vans in the drive and a date he had to be gone by. That happened in the same postcode. Some of the same officials were involved. And if you want to know why the atmosphere inside Windsor changed so fast once this started, it is because every single person working in those buildings had watched that happen 8 months earlier and understood exactly how quickly a permanent arrangement stops being permanent. Anne did not shout when she was told. She asked for the records. And that is the most dangerous thing that woman does, because a person who shouts gives you something to react to, and a person who asks for records gives you nothing at all. The storage lists came first, then the renovation requests, then the access instructions issued to the entrance staff, then, last and worst, the written objections raised by household administrators at the time, because the administrators had objected. That is the detail everything after this hangs off. One of those written warnings stated in plain language that certain objects could not be moved without family approval. It went to Camilla's office. It was received, logged, and read. The move went ahead anyway. That is the moment this stopped being a disagreement about furniture, and it is also the moment the Prince of Wales became involved, and he did not become involved because anybody asked him to. One of the sealed boxes contained something connected to his mother. I'm not going to describe it because the people who know what it is have been careful not to, and I am not going to be the person who puts it on the internet. The category is the part that matters. It was an item he understood to be protected. And protected in this context means it does not move anywhere without his direct knowledge, because that condition was put in place years ago precisely so that this could never happen again. Because it has happened before. Everything Diana owned went through a version of this after 1997. Boxes, lists, storage, a decade of arguments about which objects belong to a woman and which belong to an institution. Half of it played out in the papers while 2 teenage boys read about their mother's possessions being catalogued by strangers. Her elder son spent his 20s building rules so that nobody would ever be able to do that quietly again. And a box with a label on it had gone into storage on somebody else's instruction, without his name appearing anywhere on the paperwork. He asked one question. He asked it repeatedly over the following 2 weeks, and he did not accept an answer from anybody below the level that could give one. His question was who signed the final order. The trail did not stop at a junior aide, which is where these trails always stop when somebody wants them to. It ran up through Camilla's private office, past 2 separate written objections, and into a chain of instructions that treated Windsor Lodge as territory rather than a house. And then it got substantially worse because somebody looked at the money. Royal household resources had been used to pay for changes that had never been fully approved. Now Anne still tried to keep every part of this inside the family, and I want that on the record because it gets forgotten in the versions of this story going round. She sent a private message. No lawyers, no household bulletin, no meeting with a note-taker in the corner. 3 requests, put as reasonably as they could be put. Restore the items that had been removed. Reverse the restrictions on family access. Pause the renovation work until the family could look at all of it together. There was one motive behind that approach, and it was not tactical. She was trying to stop the thing before it reached her brother, because Charles is a man in treatment married to the woman at the center of it, and any version of this that becomes formal puts him in a position where he has to choose in front of officials. Camilla's reply was cold, and it was short. Windsor Lodge, she said, now fell under her authority. The Princess Royal should concentrate on her own household. I have read a lot of accounts of a lot of rooms in that family, and that reply is the single worst decision anybody makes in this entire story. Because of who she said it to. Anne had come to her privately, off the record, with an offer to fix it quietly and nothing in writing anywhere. That is not weakness. In that institution, that is the most generous thing one senior royal can do for another, and everybody who has worked there for more than a fortnight knows it. Camilla read the restraint as a lack of leverage. And she did not stop there. Within days, the position hardened in every direction. More staff were reassigned. A family visit that had been approved weeks in advance was cancelled with no reason given to anybody, and a new set of internal instructions went out describing the lodge, in writing, as her permanent residence. That word is the one that finished it. Permanent is a claim, and a claim invites a check, and once somebody in that household checks a claim about a building, everything else in the file becomes visible at the same time. William asked for the original occupancy documents, not a briefing note, not an aide's summary of the position, the papers themselves, the ownership record, the occupancy terms, the funding conditions, every amendment attached to any of it since the day the arrangement was made. And the expectation inside her circle at that point, from everything I can establish, was that the search would end the argument in her favor. There would be a signed grant, or a lease amendment, or a written instruction from the king, and William would be left objecting to a document his own father had signed. Administrators went through the file. There was no grant. There was no lease amendment. There was no written order from Charles. The thing they found instead is what this entire story turns on, and I will give it to you in the next few minutes. Because before I do, you need to know what else was happening inside that building while the search was going on. The atmosphere had changed, and the staff had started keeping copies. One employee described the mood inside the lodge in 2 words: careful and tense. People stopped talking in shared rooms. Instructions started arriving verbally, then being repeated through private messages that never appeared in the household's administrative channels, which is a thing that only happens when somebody has decided a written record is a liability. Some of the staff complied because they wanted to keep their jobs, and I am not going to criticize a single one of them for that. Those are ordinary people with mortgages working for the most powerful family in the country. Others quietly began saving copies, and so did Anne. Every cancelled arrangement went into a file with a date on it. Every staffing change, every access request placed beside the answer it got. The storage lists, the renovation notes, the security instructions, and the names of the individuals who had been told to carry each one out. A family disagreement was turning into a file, and a file is a completely different animal because a disagreement can be smoothed over on a Sunday and a file cannot. Then a former member of the lodge staff came forward, and what that person brought is what pulled the money into it. The renovations were not being paid for solely out of her private office. Invoices showed royal household resources being used for alterations that had never received full approval. And the way that was done is the part that tells you it was not an accident. Let me explain how spending gets hidden in a place like that, because it takes 20 seconds and it is the last technical thing I'm going to put you through. Every large estate runs on maintenance codes, broad categories that exist so that a leaking gutter and a rewired corridor can be paid for without a committee meeting about each one. Structural upkeep, necessary replacement, fabric maintenance. Nobody queries them because querying them would stop the building's functioning. The consequence is simple. Anything you can describe using one of those words gets paid without anybody looking twice. New furnishings were listed as necessary replacements. Decorative work was recorded under structural upkeep. And staff who were assigned to official duties, paid for out of the household's official budget, were being redirected to support private arrangements inside the lodge. That is no longer a question of taste. And it never was. It is a question of whose money bought what and who decided. William was shown those records, and he did not do the thing everybody in her office had prepared for. Nobody in that building has ever known that man to explode, and they were not going to start finding out that week. He went quiet, and he read every page. Then he asked 3 questions and had all 3 answered in writing. The names behind the payments, the names behind the staff reassignments, the name on the order that put items linked to his mother into storage. Every answer came back to the same office. And while all of that was being assembled, an archivist working through the residence file found one line, and it is the line the entire story ends on. The wording did not describe permanent ownership. It did not grant an unrestricted lease. It described a conditional family arrangement, dependent on continued approval and on the property being used properly. And underneath it sat a second clause that nobody in her office appeared to have read at any point. That clause had nothing to do with decoration. It dealt with misuse, unauthorized spending, restricted access, and the power of the household to withdraw the occupancy altogether when family property was treated as personal territory. Now, this next part is my reading rather than anybody's confirmed account, and I will say it once and then get out of your way. I do not think she ever read that file. I think she was told at some point years ago by somebody who was trying to be kind that the house was hers for as long as she wanted it, and she believed it, and she never once asked to see the paper it was written on because asking would have looked like doubt. That is how people lose things in that family. Not through greed, through never checking the thing everybody assured them about. William did not confront her the day the clause was found, and the restraint there is the most professional thing he does in this story. He waited until the residence file had been checked against the funding records, the staffing orders, and the instructions that moved family possessions into storage. He wanted no gaps in it, nothing that could be explained away as a misunderstanding, and nothing that would allow anybody to say afterwards that the paperwork had been read in a hurry by people who wanted a particular answer. By the time the meeting was arranged, he had everything. She came into it believing it would be a discussion about procedure. 2 households, a difference of view, some tidying up of who signs what. He made it clear inside the first minute that it was about conduct. He put the documents in front of her one at a time. The cancelled family visits, the reassigned employees, the renovation charges against household accounts, the access restrictions issued to the entrance staff, and last, the storage order covering the belongings connected to Diana. Then he asked her the question the whole review had been built around. His question was what gave her the right. She did not answer with a document. Everybody in that room noticed it. And it is the moment the outcome became inevitable, because in a meeting about paperwork, the person without paperwork has already lost and usually knows it about 10 seconds after everybody else does. She answered with position. The residence had been placed at her disposal. The household understood what her role was, and the king had raised no objection to any of the changes. Her argument underneath it was one sentence. The approval of a king does not need writing down every time his wife replaces a member of staff or moves a chair, and in fairness to her, that is how that building has worked for most of its history. A word in a corridor from the right person has moved more inside that institution than any signed instruction ever has, and everybody who works there knows it. William disagreed with her, and the way he did it is worth hearing. Windsor Lodge, he said, is not a private reward. It carries family history, it costs official money, it holds protected objects, and its arrangements involve more than one household. A verbal understanding cannot cancel written conditions, and it certainly cannot justify moving possessions connected to his mother into storage without telling him they were going. And that is when she changed tactic, and this is the part where I think a great many people underestimate how good she is at this. She warned him about his father. Pushing the matter any further, she said, would embarrass the king. A public dispute over a Windsor residence would look to the country like a monarch unable to control his own family. It would produce headlines for a fortnight. It would set 2 households against each other in print. And it would invite the one question nobody in that institution ever once asked out loud, which is who really holds authority inside that place now. That warning was aimed precisely, and it was aimed at the one thing he cares about. Back down, and the family avoids the scene. Continue, and every column inch of the scene lands on you. He continued, and what he ordered was not a conversation. He ordered a review of every decision taken since she had begun treating the lodge as her own residence, and he defined the scope so that nothing could be left out of it. Occupancy, security, staffing, spending, maintenance, guest access, and the removal of belongings. Nothing accepted on reputation. Nothing accepted because a senior person said so. Every claim required a document behind it. Anne became the center of that review, because Anne had the file. She had preserved the written objections raised by household administrators at the time, and those objections are the part that finished it, because they established that nobody was confused about the rules. One warned that long-serving staff could not be removed without consultation. Another queried maintenance accounts being used for private alteration work. And a third asked her office to delay the transfer of family objects until ownership and access had been confirmed. The reply to that third one ran to 3 words. Proceed as instructed. That line removes the entire defense. Confusion is a real thing, and it happens in every large household on Earth. Confusion does not survive a written warning followed by a written instruction to carry on anyway. More material kept arriving as the review went on. A security note listing names connected to William's household on a restricted access list, which means somebody sat down and wrote out which members of the royal family required checking at the door of a royal residence. A staffing memo describing rooms that had been kept for family visits as being under the exclusive direction of her aides. An invoice for work that had been requested before anybody approved it. None of those is dramatic on its own. Every one of them can be explained by a person having a busy month. Put 40 of them in date order, and you are not looking at a series of decisions anymore. You are looking at a system. And the most revealing thing in the whole file came from an administrator who had sat in a planning meeting months earlier, before any of this surfaced. She had talked about the lodge in that meeting as though its future was already settled. New guest arrangements, a revised staff structure, rooms that would no longer be available for shared family use. Somebody in that meeting asked reasonably whether permanent authorization had ever been received, and an aide answered that nobody would challenge the Queen. Sit with that answer for a second, because that sentence is the entire foundation of everything she built. Not a document, not an instruction from the King, not a clause in a file. A belief stated out loud in a working meeting that no one in that institution would ever put the question to her. Everything downstream of that sentence was constructed on it. The renovations, the staffing, the access lists, the storage orders, all of it rested on one assumption about how other people would behave. William's review tested the assumption, and the assumption failed. By the time officials finished, the conclusion was not close. Her position at Windsor Lodge was not protected by ownership, by a permanent lease, or by any unrestricted royal grant. She had been permitted to occupy the residence under conditions requiring proper use, shared family access, and respect for what the house was for. And the same documents gave the household the authority to step in when those conditions were broken. William asked for one final verification before he did anything, and the question he asked is the one that shows he had already worked out where it ended. Could the clause be enforced without his father signing a new order and without her consent? The answer came back that evening. It could. And it arrived with something else attached, which had come out of Anne's file that afternoon. Camilla had received 3 separate written warnings before the review even began. Every one of them explained that her authority over the residence was conditional. Everyone asked her to reverse a specific decision. She ignored all 3. At that point, the palace was no longer deciding whether a woman had misunderstood an arrangement. It was deciding what to do about somebody who had been told in writing 3 times, understood exactly what she was risking, and carried on regardless. Anne put the material in sequence rather than by category, and that decision is why it worked. Room plans first, then the staffing schedules, then the storage records. After those, the instructions given to security, the invoices charged against maintenance accounts, and the correspondence showing how the objections had been dealt with. Not answered, overruled, or ignored. And one item in that file stopped William for longer than anything else in it, and it was a photograph. A sitting room taken before the alterations began. Family pieces on the walls and on the surfaces. The room as it had looked for decades. A second photograph of the same room, taken days later. The family pieces gone. Replacement furniture already delivered and positioned. A new portrait hanging over the mantelpiece. The room did not look shared anymore. It looked claimed, and that is the word everybody who has seen those two frames side by side has used about them, because the changes were not random, and that is the thing the invoices prove on their own. They follow a design. Her personal guests were given priority in the guest suites. Her aides controlled who came through the entrance. Staff loyal to the old household structure were moved away from the parts of the building that mattered, and objects connected to earlier generations came off the walls and out of the rooms and went into boxes. Every single alteration made that lodge feel less like a family residence and more like an extension of one private office. And that is when Anne understood what the remark to her had really meant. Concentrate on your own household. She had taken that at the time as a woman being sharp in a difficult conversation. Read it against the room plans and the access lists, and it stops being a remark. It is a description of a plan that was already running. Neither Anne nor William, nor anybody else in that family was being asked to tolerate somebody else's taste in curtains. They were being moved out of a house, slowly, one arrangement at a time. The strongest single piece of evidence came last, and it came from a long-serving employee who had stayed silent through all of it. That person had been in the room when the first storage instructions were discussed. They had watched the unease move through the older members of staff, the ones who have worked in those buildings for 20 and 30 years, and who understood immediately what was being asked of them. Nobody wanted to defy the Queen. Nobody wanted to lose a job held for most of a working life. But one instruction had felt serious enough to keep, and that employee kept a copy of it. It was signed. It ordered the removal of several protected belongings, and it directed staff to complete the transfer before the next scheduled family visit. Read that second half again because it is the part that ends every innocent explanation. The timing establishes motive. Those objects were not moved because a roof was leaking or a room needed clearing for works. They were moved on a deadline set by the date on which members of the family were due to walk through the building and see the rooms. Then Anne found the document that had been sent 2 days before it. The warning, in writing, stating that the listed belongings required consultation and that no transfer should proceed until ownership and family access had been confirmed. The removal order was issued after that warning arrived. 2 days after. That killed the last credible version of events. An order that slips through a busy office is a mistake. An order issued 48 hours after somebody has explained the risk in writing is a decision, and everybody sitting on that review understood it the moment the two dates were put side by side. The tone inside the review team changed after that. Officials who had been careful with their language for weeks started saying plainly what the file showed. The lodge had been treated as private territory. Household money had paid for part of it. Family access had been set aside. Her representatives made one final attempt, and it was the only one left available. The king had given verbal permission. That claim forced the review into its most delicate stage because it is not an absurd claim. Charles may well have said warm and general things to his wife about that house, more than once, over years. Most married people say that kind of thing to each other. The officials went looking for anything at all that would support it. A signed letter, a lease amendment, a royal warrant, a note from the king's private secretary, a line in a diary confirming that permanent authority had been discussed at any point with anybody. There was nothing. And the distinction they landed on is the fairest sentence in this entire story. Charles may very well have allowed his wife to use that house. Allowing somebody to use a house is not the same thing as granting them a house. He may have known she wanted to make changes. Knowing that is not proof that he authorized the removal of protected belongings, the use of household money for private alterations, or the restriction of his own family's access to a residence. Words spoken privately cannot cancel conditions accepted in writing. That principle is the only reason any large institution on Earth still functions. William asked one more question before he signed anything, and it was about the Constitution rather than the House. Could the occupancy be terminated without turning this into a dispute about the powers of the king? The advisors took the clause and tested it against every action in Anne's file, one at a time. Their conclusion was not qualified. The conditions had been broken repeatedly, in writing, after warnings, and the household held the power to withdraw the arrangement. William and Anne approved the next step together. A formal notice was drawn up. It listed the breaches. It ordered all unauthorized work to stop immediately. It restored control of the residence to household administration, and it required her personal staff to leave the building. There was one final line at the bottom of it. The keys were to be surrendered by a fixed deadline. That notice arrived at the lodge, and the reaction was immediate. Every account of it is the same. Doors closing, calls being made, staff being told to say nothing to anybody. One aide told the rest of them that the decision would be reversed before morning. Morning came. Nothing had changed. The deadline stood exactly where it had been written. And while her office was still ringing round, looking for somebody willing to stop it, officials at the palace were already preparing inventories, access orders, and a security plan for the handover. The deadline arrived on an ordinary Windsor morning, and the first vehicle through the gates was not hers. It carried 2 household officials, a security supervisor, and the inventory team running the handover. No photographers outside. No announcement drafted. The palace wanted that building transferred quietly before the rumor hardened into a version nobody could correct, and they had learned that lesson 8 months earlier, watching removal vans at another address in the same park. Inside, her people were already moving. Personal files coming off desks, garment cases going down the main staircase, framed photographs being wrapped in cloth and set beside labelled boxes. One assistant going room to room checking drawers and cupboards against a private list, quickly, the way somebody works when they are not certain how long they have. Another was at the entrance demanding to know who had authorized officials to walk into that house before the Queen had finished speaking with the King. The answer was in the notice, and the officials read it to him. Authority over the residence returned to household administration at the deadline. From that moment, no room in that building could be closed to inspection. Nothing left the property without being checked against an inventory. And no member of her private staff could remain there after the final handover. Nobody argued with him. They read the terms out and started work. And the calm is what made it unbearable, which I do not think anybody on her side had anticipated. She had prepared for resistance. Resistance can be turned into outrage. Raised voices in a royal residence become disrespect, and disrespect becomes a story about a future king humiliating his father's wife while his father is ill, and that story would have run for a month. Instead, every movement was measured, every box logged, every door opened under written authority by men being scrupulously polite. There was nothing in it to fight. Then the first dispute started, over a set of silver frames. They had been placed among her personal effects. The inventory listed them as part of the lodge collection. Her aide said they had been gifts. The officials asked to see the records. None were produced. The frames stayed. Then a writing desk. Then 2 paintings. Then a cabinet containing correspondence from an earlier royal household, which was the moment several people in that hallway understood exactly what had nearly left the building. The same rule applied every time, and it took about 4 seconds to state. Personal property could go. Family property stayed. Room by room, across a morning, the boundary she had spent months ignoring was put back exactly where it had always been. William and Anne were not there. That was deliberate, and it was the right call. Their presence would have handed her a scene, and a scene was the only thing left that could still have rescued her position. Their authority was in every document on that table instead. Anne's records had established the pattern. William's review had triggered the clause. The people carrying it out had never met either of them. She came down to the entrance hall before midday. She was composed at first. She asked to see the senior official. She questioned the timetable. She said the residence could not be surrendered while discussions with the king were still going on. The official told her that a family discussion does not suspend a notice. The deadline had passed. The occupancy had ended. That is where the composure broke. She accused Anne of having engineered the whole thing from the beginning, and said the questions about staffing and storage had been pretexts built to make her look like an intruder in a house she had lived in for years. Then she turned to the subject of William, and she said the thing that had clearly been sitting in her for weeks. He was using his mother's memory to punish anybody who stood in his way. The hall went completely quiet. And here is the thing about that accusation, which I have gone back and forth on more than any other part of this story. It is not a stupid accusation. It is the one thing she could have said that goes anywhere near the truth of that man. Because Diana is the engine underneath every decision he has made about property, paperwork, and protection since he was 15 years old, and everybody who follows this family knows it. The trouble with it is the dates. The warnings came before William was involved at all. The invoices existed before anybody looked at them. The removal order was signed 2 days after a written instruction not to proceed, by an office that had been told 3 separate times where the limits were. None of that was built by a grieving son. All of it was built by her own office and filed by her own staff. His answer was already written into the handover instructions, and the official read it out. The removal was not punishment for anything historical. It followed repeated breaches involving access, staffing, spending, and protected family property. She rejected it and made one last stand, and it is the detail that finishes her. She demanded that one private sitting room stay sealed until the king personally decided what happened to it. Her aide produced a separate key and refused to put it with the others. For several minutes, nothing moved. The security supervisor read the notice again. The senior official opened the full occupancy schedule and went down it in front of everybody. Every room in that building was listed. There was no private exception anywhere in it, no retained suite, no surviving right of access after termination. She was told, without any threat in it at all, what would happen next. Keeping that key would be recorded as a refusal to complete the handover. Security would open the room, document the contents, and note that the key had not been surrendered voluntarily. The aide looked at her. She gave a small nod. The key went on the table. Somebody left a comment under one of my videos a while back that has stayed with me since, and it belongs on that hallway table more than anywhere I have ever put it. They wrote that nobody in that family is ever thrown out. They are only ever asked for the keys. I thought it was a good line at the time. Then I read an account of a woman nodding at an aide in an entrance hall at Windsor, and I stopped thinking it was a line at all. By late afternoon, the vehicles were loaded and her staff left in stages, watched by officials checking every package against an inventory. At the gates, one car paused for a moment before pulling out onto the road away from Windsor. The palace wanted no public confirmation of any of it. The advisors argued for describing it as a routine change of arrangements and letting the whole thing fade, which is what that building always argues for. William and Anne overruled them. Too many people knew. Too many records existed. Silence would have left the space for somebody else's version, and they confirmed it. She had vacated the lodge. Her private staff no longer controlled the residence. The keys had been returned, the unauthorized work stopped, and household administration had resumed authority over every room, every account, and every access point in the building. And then William ordered the restoration, which is the only part of this he seems to have taken any satisfaction from. Staff reopened the storage records and identified every object that had gone out during her occupation, working from photographs, inventories, and the old room plans. Items connected to Queen Elizabeth were separated out from the general furnishings. Items connected to Diana were checked against his own records before anything was moved. One box stayed sealed longer than the rest. It held the item that had pulled him into the whole thing in the first place. The wrapping was intact and had not been touched, and the label on the outside showed that it had been scheduled for transfer somewhere else entirely. Had that employee kept quiet, that object would have gone into a wider royal collection, correctly catalogued, entirely legally, and out of the reach of the only two people alive who know what it is. That is the reason for all of it, and it fits in one sentence. Diana's things have been disappearing quietly into that institution since 1997, and her elder son has spent his adult life making certain that the last few of them stop where he can see them. Charles was left with the questions, and nobody has answered any of them. The first is how much he knew. The second is whether he approved the renovations at all, or whether his name was used because nobody would ever go and ask him directly. Did he understand that household money was paying for private work? And did he know that belongings connected to his own mother and to his first wife had been crated up and driven out of a Windsor residence 2 days after somebody put a warning in writing? No answer came from anywhere. The silence protected the king. It did not do much for anybody's trust in him. Camilla walked into that family with nothing and spent 30 years building a position out of patience. And she was still the only person in that institution who could stop almost anything with one telephone call. She lost a house because she never once picked up the file and read what it said. And because when 3 separate people wrote to her explaining exactly where the line was, she decided that the line did not apply to her.